They thought your absence would be a plea. They thought your quiet was a surrender. They thought the lack of your voice meant the door remained unlocked, waiting for their footsteps to return. But they didn't expect the weight of what you finally stopped saying. Because silence, when forged in clarity, doesn't beg, it dissects. And right now, it is slowly breaking the architecture of their ego. You know the exhaustion of a conversation that never actually ended. The one that echoes in the quiet hours of the morning when the rest of the world has finally shut its eyes. You replay the deflections, the manufactured urgency, the subtle recalibrations that left you questioning your own memory. You were trained to fill the space, to over-explain, to translate their chaos into something your nervous system could survive. And somewhere along the line, you realize that speaking into a vacuum only drains your own lungs. You didn't withdraw because you fractured. You withdrew because you finally mapped the mechanism. You stopped feeding a fire that only ever warmed them. And now, you're sitting in the stillness, watching the physics of that choice unfold. Chapter 1. The Architecture of the Unspoken. Let's name the weight you've been carrying without a label. For years, your quiet was treated as a pause in a script they authored for you. Every withheld message, every measured response, every moment you refused to escalate was interpreted as hesitation, not boundary. They mapped your patience to a renewable resource, assuming your engagement was an infinite well they could draw from at will. But unacknowledged pain doesn't evaporate. Calcifies. You felt it in the tension behind your ribs. That heavy, suffocating awareness that your words were being cataloged, weaponized, and filed away for future leverage. You weren't communicating. You were negotiating with a ghost. So you did the only thing that preserved your structural integrity. You stopped translating. You stopped performing emotional labor for a dynamic that only ever required your compliance. The silence you're holding isn't emptiness. It's a withdrawal of consent. And consent, once revoked at the root, cannot be reconstructed with apologies. Chapter 2. The Fracture in the Mirror. What they missed wasn't your distance. It was the shift in frequency. They operated under the illusion that your reaction was guaranteed, that your emotional architecture would always align with their provocations. They read your boundaries as temporary weather, not permanent geography. Every dynamic built on friction survives because of a predictable cycle: provocation, pursuit, resolution, reset. They expected you to play your part in the choreography. The push, the pull, the dramatic return to center. But you stepped off the stage. And stillness is a foreign language to anyone who only speaks in escalation. When the anticipated feedback loop fails to activate, the entire mechanism seizes. You didn't signal defeat. You signaled an exit from their theater. And when the primary witness leaves, the performance doesn't just end. It collapses into the raw, unfiltered exposure of its own artifice. They're not missing you. They're missing the reflection they used to project onto you. Chapter 3. The Mechanics of Ego Collapse. Let's dissect the machinery. The unrefined ego does not feed on truth. It feeds on validation. It requires an external surface to bounce against, a continuous stream of attention to confirm its own center of gravity. When you engaged, you provided that surface. Your frustration, your attempts at reasoning, your careful explanations of why things couldn't continue unchanged. These weren't dialogues. They were metabolic fuel. Intermittent reinforcement, calibrated tightly enough to keep you invested, loosely enough to maintain their leverage. But silence disrupts the circuit. It creates a psychological vacuum. And the human nervous system is wired to resist vacuums. In the absence of your reaction, the mind begins to scramble for data it can no longer access. Projection activates. Cognitive dissonance fractures the internal narrative. The story they've been telling themselves starts to bleed at the edges. Because if you're not reacting, the premise of their control collapses. The ego cannot survive without its mirror. So it turns inward, searching for cracks, manufacturing narratives, rehearsing justifications. It begins to cannibalize its own certainty. Not out of remorse. Out of structural panic. Chapter 4. The Gravity of the Void. This is where the invisible toll begins. You assume they're detached. They aren't. They're drowning in the geometry of your absence. Think of it like removing a load-bearing wall from a house that was never built to code. At first, nothing moves. Then the floorboards warp. The plaster splits. The entire structure groans under its own unsupported weight. That is the physics of your silence applied to a fragile identity. It forces them into a room with no distractions. No manufactured crises. No version of you to chase, to guilt, to manipulate back into orbit. Just the unvarnished echo of their own patterns. And they will test the perimeter. You already recognize the architecture of it. The sudden, unearned generosity. The vague provocations disguised as nostalgia. The carefully worded messages that look like closure but read like hooks. These aren't attempts to rebuild. They are stress tests. Desperate measurements to see if the foundation has truly shifted. But you've already felt the change. The hook no longer catches. Because the void you created isn't meant to be filled by them. It's meant to be occupied by you. The ego doesn't break from confrontation. It fractures from irrelevance. Chapter 5. The Sovereign Stillness. And this is where you cross the threshold. Silence is not a tactic. It is a reclamation. Every minute you refuse to translate their noise into your reality, you are rebuilding your nervous system. Recalibrating your boundaries from the inside out. You are learning the most dangerous truth in human dynamics. You do not owe anyone an explanation for your peace. The transformation isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming precise. You stop asking why they refuse to change. You start observing what their patterns actually cost you. You stop waiting for a reckoning that will never arrive, and you begin treating your own attention as currency. Scarce. Non-refundable. Strategically deployed. This is the anatomy of real power. Not dominance. Not retaliation. Just calibrated distance. The quiet realization that your energy is the battlefield, and you have finally raised the drawbridge. You are no longer a participant in their economy. You are the vault. You didn't lose them when you went quiet. You finally found yourself. The ego doesn't shatter from volume. It fractures from absence. Let them sit in the vacuum you created. Let them learn the weight of a room with no echo. You are no longer available for negotiation. You are no longer a mirror for their distortion. Your peace is no longer up for debate. You hold the silence. And the silence holds everything. Final line, short, deliberate, lingers. Starve the illusion. Feed your reality.